welcome back. In this lesson, you're going to have a chance to practice group by on your own. So this is the final part of this extra super packed module. Thank you so much for sticking with me on this one. So here we are in the group by DIY. The examples that I have prepared for you. First, using our taxi trip data that we've been using since the beginning of the course, what is the highest trip distance by rate code? What is the most expensive single person trip by vendor ID? What is the last trip in the data? What are the total passengers in the data by vendor ID? And finally, how many trips are there by payment type? Go ahead, pause the video, take a few minutes, try to answer these, and when you're ready, we'll come back together and review the answers like we usually do. Okay, so let's go over these answers together. Our first question is, what is the highest trip distance by rate code? So we know trip distance is going to be our aggregate function. We want max trip distance as max distance from our table here. And we want it by rate code. So rate code is going to be our first column, and that's what we're going to be grouping by. And we're going to do group by one, and then I'm just going to order by one just so it looks nice and organized for me. Okay, I get the green check mark. It says that I can run it. Let's do it. So we have our 7 rate codes, 1 through 6 and 99, and then we have the max distance. So that looks kind of crazy. So if we were to pull up rate code 1 and we were to find the trip that had this amount of distance, we would probably find that these are all errors. It's probably all bad data. I can't even imagine how you could go 1.3 million miles. But that's how you do it. Okay, question 2. What is the most expensive single person trip by vendor ID? Okay, so we're going to do select vendor ID. That's who we're grouping by. We want most expensive. So max, I think it's fare amount as max fare from our table. And we want a single person trip. So we want where passenger count equals 1. And we're going to group by vendor ID. And we're going to run it. Okay, so for vendor ID 2, the most expensive trip was $10,000. And for vendor ID 1, the most expensive single person trip was almost $100,000. So again, whenever you're looking at real life data and you're looking at the max and the min, you're probably going to find what we call bad data, outliers, typos, things like that. So when we're doing this type of analysis, if we really wanted to find the max fare, I would probably add another clause. So I'd say where passenger count equals 1 and fare amount less than some reasonable number. I would think $1,000 is anything more than $1,000, I think would be like a really crazy fare amount. So what if we did that? So now what's happened is I said, okay, only show me where I have a single passenger and my fare amount is less than 0. Of those rows, what is the maximum fare amount that you find? For vendor ID 2, we see that we find a maximum of $550. For vendor ID 1, we see we go right up to the line, $999.99. Just something to think about. Okay. Question 3, what is the last trip in the data? So this doesn't have a group by or anything. So we can just do select max drop off. Can't remember what it's called. Let's look at the table. And we're going to search drop off date time. What is the max drop off date time? And you might say, why do I want the drop off date time versus the pickup date time? Well, if you imagine you have your last trip in the data, the drop off time is when the trip ends versus the pickup time is when it starts. So I want to find when was the last trip, when did it end? But if you did either one, I think it's okay. Since we're not grouping by anything, we can hit just Control Enter. And so this is going to look at all of our data, and it's going to find the drop-off date time that is the last trip. So this is interesting. So we see that, oh, we didn't relabel it. So if you don't relabel it, if you don't put that alias, you get this generic column name. Let's also do, while we're here, max pickup date time. So we see our max pickup happens, I think this is exactly when you would expect. So this is for 2014 data only. So our max pickup was on New Year's Eve, 1 minute, 1 second before it turned to New Year's Day. So that seems like a really reasonable number. In comparison, our max drop-off date looks like it was in 2016, August 31. So this to me feels like that might not be reliable data. Something happened where someone's meter didn't go off, or we had some bad data there. So the pickup time looks reliable. Drop-off time, not so much. So I would answer that the last trip in the data, it's most likely this one right here that went all the way up to New Year's Eve, 1 second before it turned to New Year's Day. And the reason why I'm saying that is because this particular data says that it's only supposed to contain 2014 data. So 2016, I don't know about him. Okay, moving right along. What are the total passengers in the data by vendor ID? So if I want total passengers, that's going to be sum, and I want it by vendor ID. Select vendor ID. Sum, I think it's passenger count from my data, group by 1, order by 1. Okay, I get the green check marks. That means I wrote everything right. Control Enter. So this is interesting too. So we noticed between vendor ID 1 and vendor ID 2 that they really had a similar split in the data when we were looking at the total fare, the average fare, things like that. However, when we look at total passengers, it looks like vendor ID 2 has a lot more passengers than vendor ID 1. That to me indicates that maybe it's possible that vendor ID 2 just picks up a lot more families or larger parties than vendor ID 1. It could also be that vendor ID 2 might have some weird data in it. So let's also go ahead and put in the max passenger count because I'm curious. Okay, and so this is my tip-off right here. The fact that vendor ID 2 for a yellow taxi cab, we're saying that he had 208 passengers in a single trip. That's kind of crazy. So there's probably something weird going on with this particular vendor ID. So that's just something we want to think about. In comparison, vendor ID 1, the max passenger is 9, which is a lot. But I could imagine a scenario where you have a really big minivan or a big SUV and you could potentially fit in 9 people. Okay. How many trips are there by payment type? So when we see how many, that means we want to do a count. by payment type. So we're going to group it by payment type, and we're going to do count. And so here we see the payment type and the total trips. And count is kind of interesting because what it does is it just goes through each row in the data. So if I'm looking at this data over here, what count does is it just goes row by row and it counts. You are, let's see, rate code. You are rate code 4, so you get a 1 for the rate code 4, and the next time it sees a rate code 4, it's going to tick it up to 2. So for rate code 5, it would go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it would just keep going. So when you're doing the count, you're not really limited to say count by payment type. I could also do count vendor ID. I could also do count passenger, because when you're counting, you're not looking at what the value is. You're just looking, is there a value there? And these should all be the same unless I'm missing a value somewhere. Because if you're missing a value, you don't get counted. Okay, so let's see. And just like we hypothesized, if we do total trips using counting the payment type, we get the same number as if we counted the vendor ID, and we get the same number if we did the total trips. The only time it would be different is if we had a null. So let's look at our data and see if we have one that has a null in it. Okay, let's try this one. So let's see if we count him, what's going to happen. Okay, so we see when we count total trips using the store and forward flag, if you have nulls, it's not going to get counted. It's a missing value, so it does not get included. And so that's why when we're looking at total trips, we can use pretty much any column unless it has nulls. Then it's not going to be the same number. And depending if you want to count something with a null versus without a null, it kind of goes to the business case and what you're trying to do. In general, if you want to find something like how many trips are there by payment type, we want to include every single entry that there is. We want to count that. So using the store and forward flag wouldn't be good. Another option you can do, and you might see this in other examples, is you can do count star. And what count star does is it just says, I'm going to count any row that has a value. And so we see when we do count star, that's the same thing as if we did count payment type, vendor ID, or passenger count. So it's just a couple different ways that you can use the count function. Let's summarize all of the great things we did in this lesson. First, you took time to try and solve 5 different group by problems. Whether you got the answer exactly right or not, all of this is practice, and the fact that you took an attempt is a really big accomplishment, so I'm really proud of you. We reviewed the answers together in the BigQuery console, and while we were doing that, we also took some time to interpret our answers, keeping a business mindset. So not just doing the task, accepting the answer, and thinking nothing else about it. We thought analytically about, what do these answers mean? Is this good data? What would this mean for our future analysis? In our next module, we will continue doing the group bys, looking a little bit more into different types of functions. See you then. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, I would be so appreciative if you could like the video and subscribe to help me create more content for you. Thank you.